CSIS suggests that those who oppose gender ideology are a violent threat in Canada. Again, this is post-millennial who tend to lean more right-leaning. But it was interesting. They did kind of talk about different things that came out of this report. This was talked about and reported on back in February by CBC and others. But then as well, additionally, more data came forward in an actual full report and on May 7th, and that's why I picked up again. But it says in its annual report for 2023, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service says that Canadians opposed to gender ideology are a possible violent threat. The annual report states that CSIS assesses that the violent threat posed by the anti-gender movement is almost certain to continue over the coming year, and that violent actors may be inspired by the University of Waterloo attack to carry out their own extreme violence against the LGBT community or against other targets they view as representing the gender ideology agenda. While saying that the anti-gender movement poses a significant threat to Canada's national security, the report then admitted while the movement may collectively hold extreme views, CSIS assesses that only a small portion of adherents are willing to engage in serious violence.
I think this is just annoying, honestly. I've got a couple thoughts. So my first thought is that obviously we don't condone any violence towards any group. That's just straight up.
Simple.
Yep. There's a truth for you. Don't condone violence against any group. Also, the fact that they released this report in its full glory, but yet withheld the RCMP report on threats to Canada. Why did this one make it out there without the million redactions and the other one not? That's interesting.
Interesting question.
Yeah, right? And then the last thing I have to say is like, they've also said in this report that they can't find good examples, but they view this as a potential threat. So this is all posturing, maybes, could happen. It just, to me, it seems like there's not enough meat to it.
Yeah.
Like if I think about the things that are really ticking off Canadians, this one's annoying, but it's nothing compared to the cost of living crisis and the opioid crisis and the myriad of crises around housing and homelessness. Like I really don't see this as being it. And so that's why I'm like extremely mad that they talk about this being the big threat. And it's like when we saw from the RCMP report that actually housing and homelessness is going to be one of the major disruptors to peace and harmony in our country. So I don't know, annoying.
Yeah. Well, what I thought was really interesting about the report is that's how they started it off. It's like, well, this group of people, they could get violent. But then as the report progressed, it was like, they're actually not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. Like that's what ticked me off about it the most. It's like they had this like big bark at the beginning, hoping people stop reading there. And then by the end, it's like, yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal. It's this type of like, with an organization that is supposed to just be nonpartisan, supposed to just speak the facts of what they're seeing, it feels the way this report was structured that there was an agenda behind it, which I'm not a huge fan of. And they're basing it off of one attack that happened at Waterloo. How about the myriad of attacks and things that are happening against the Jewish community in this country? And people just openly speaking out against how they want death to that group. But that's not a threat at all.
Well, that's actually not entirely true. They do mention anti-Semitism.
They mention anti-Semitism. It's not on the headline of what the report was it?
No, it wasn't.
That's BS. Don't give me that crap.
They do mention it in there.
They do,
but it is not
twice.
But it is not the focus of the article. You're right. But I wonder if this is kind of to prop up the funding that the Trudeau government is putting towards. They call it the 2S LGBTQIA plus action plan. So, which has been awarded $1.1 million on a purge fund that targets hateful parents opposing gender ideology and LGBTQ indoctrination. So I'm like, is this just to try and make that spend legitimized? And is that what we're seeing? Because I know we have seen in other cases where the government has funded an organization, given them grants to then go write a report that is supportive of the carbon tax and talk about how great it is, and then make it look like it's a separate third-party body writing this report when you follow the money, it's actually all paid for by the current government through grants and through departments and through the climate change. I was like, what is that called? Climate Change Canada. So is this another example of that? Maybe. Who knows? But then I might be a conspiracy theorist.
You're probably right. It sucks, but that's kind of how government public works in general. Like if you're trying to get funding, you want to understand what the agenda is of the government that is giving out the funds, and you want to kind of make, slant your language a little bit in a specific way so that you can go ahead and get that funding. I'm not saying it's happening here, but I'm talking in general. If you're trying to get like funding from a COA or something like this, like you look at what the mandates are of that organization. You're trying to, okay, this is our project. This is what we'll slant some language here and there to kind of, make ourselves in line with that mandate. That's just how public works and public government works, period. I'll say it. You're likely right, is what kind of bums me out about that. Because that's obviously you were joking earlier, but like, it's, the violence against the LGBT community is the big thing in this report. And then we're just like, we're also talking about anti-Semitism. That's kind of been happening since, lately here in the country. And it's like, well, why is that part so quiet? Why is this part so loud when you even said it yourself that it's not really happening? But then the thing we're seeing in the news and seeing people out in the streets and Jewish communities being inundated and harassed. That was volume 2 down here. But this is up at 12. So, yeah, I'd agree there's some type of politics involved there.
And the hard part, too, is like when you talk about what does violence mean? Going back to words again, because based on people's subjective truths, the fact that somebody's like, no, I don't want my child learning that. They're like, that's violence against the community. So it's like, are they including that in this? Like, what are they defining as acts against this community? Because I've heard like through different individuals that if you like, this is the whole reason why we have this Purge the Bad Parents Act funded by 1.1 million from the government, is because parents are like, no, I actually don't believe this. We're going to teach our kids otherwise. And that's considered hateful. So is that included in part of this? Who knows? Because we don't know how they're defining this. And they're calling it violent extremism. And we know from the online harms bill that they are defining comments that are anti the narrative of the government of the day as being hateful and violent and extreme. And it's like, no, they're not. Like, actual violence is violence. Words are not. I'm sorry. I do not believe that. That's my truth. So take it and leave it.
Reg is on one today. Let's go.
And I will say, I play hockey with the LGBTQ plus community.
Yep.
And like, they're not expressing this. This is not what I'm hearing from this group. Like, this just feels like a whole different, like, kettle of fish, I guess I'll say. Yeah. And there is one part of that group, though, that has been very vocal. And even within the LGBTQ plus community, like, they're still not organized or really kind of all singing the same song around a lot of these trans issues, especially like when it comes to gender transition and medically offered puberty blockers to children, like all this stuff like that. That's still a topic for debate. And you can actually talk to the LGBT community because they're still debating it themselves. So when you think about like gender affirming care being mentioned directly, like, so are people within that community who are not supportive of that, for children, does that count as hate? Like, you just taking it all apart, you realize how subjective this whole thing is. And so what is a threat? What is extremism? What is hate? What is counted as hate? Like, it kind of falls apart. And then I look at this and I'm like, oh wow, this actually like folds up like a wet paper box. Like, it sucks. It's bad use of tax dollars again.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see what their data set was.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's essentially what this conversation comes down to, is like, what was the data set being used and how did they come to the conclusions they did? If we're bringing this down to a scientific response and scientific results, what what was really used, and how do they define what was the definition of the words they're using, and what was the data set they're using? Those are legitimate questions when it comes to this report.
Yeah. What are the questions that were asked? When you see a good report come out in any social science, they actually list out the questions that were asked of participants or folks in the study. We don't see that.
Yeah.
So that's an important element that's missing. And like I said, I don't condone harm to any group. And so I think that like actually physically attacking or defaming individuals in this community, I think that's totally wrong. But as far as like what is actually on the horizon for things that are going to make Canadians violent, I don't think this is it.
That was electric, wasn't it? Well, we enjoyed it. Hope you did too. If you did, you can check this video out here to the top right corner right near my window. Get over. There it is. There it is right there. And if you liked that, you can also check this one right here. We love you. Have a good one. Peace out.